I'm Robert Brenner. I'm a licensed New York City tour guide. I'm a member of the Guides Association in New York City. I'm a docent for the Municipal Art Society of New York. And, almost a lifelong New Yorker. I first started hanging out in the Village in the 1970s as a teenager. I'd go drinking cappuccinos in Cafe Reggio or browsing in record stores at Bleecker Bob's. Of course, it wasn't all fun and games back then. I'm old enough to remember, for example, when abortion was illegal. I'm old enough to remember when homosexuality was classified as a mental disorder. And I'm sadly also old enough to remember the AIDS crisis directly. I remember when it was called GRID, gay-related immune deficiency. Some of my close friends died during that period. Things have changed, mostly for the better, but there's always a danger of slipping backwards, and that's one of the themes of this tour is fighting for your health rights. So of course, we're meeting here. There's the AIDS Memorial in the background, but this was not obviously always the AIDS Memorial. Starting in 1921, there was the Loews Sheridan movie theater was on this triangle. In the 1970s, this triangle was the Village Green. It was a combination park recycling center. That's the way I knew it. Ecology was very big in the 70s. We thought we were going to save the planet and end global warming and stuff like that. I don't know how that turned out. It seems like we're having that discussion all over again. In '87, though, St. Vincent took over this space and put up what was called the Materials Receiving Center, which was this short, squat, triangular-shaped building that was used basically. Supplies coming in to St. Vincent's would unload there, and then through a series of underground tunnels be delivered to the hospital, which was across the street. It wasn't always there. The original St. Vincent's, built in 1833, wasn't here. It was over on East 13th Street. Moved over here in 1855, and it moved here to be closer to its constituency. Mostly poor, working-class Irish Catholics. This was a time when hospitals were very sectarian in nature. There were Catholic hospitals for Catholics, there were Jewish hospitals for Jews, there were Methodist hospitals for Methodists. Everyone was kind of concerned about proselytizing and deathbed conversions in hospitals. So you had to have a hospital for your particular religion. So St. Vincent's was here for a long time. It was here for the Triangle Shirt Waste Factory fire in 1911. It was here for the Titanic disaster in 1912. They took the survivors directly from the docks to this hospital. And of course, it was here for the AIDS crisis in the 1980s. A lot of the victims were brought here to St. Vincent's Hospital. St. Vincent's closed in 2010 and has now, of course, been replaced by this very expensive condominium building. When it opened, it went for $3,500 a square foot. So that's a big change from what was essentially a hospital, serving people who, didn't have insurance or had limited insurance. The one piece of St. Vincent's that is still really functioning as a medical building of some sort is this funny-looking building behind you. So we're moving to a city that has, lots of standalone emergency rooms, fewer and fewer hospitals. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I'm not so sure. We're good at treating people in emergency, but not so good for long-term care. What happens the next time there's a major epidemic in New York City? Do we just even have enough beds for all the patients? I don't know. It's unclear. And the New School was sort of a university in exile for left-wing intellectuals, especially Jewish intellectuals, fleeing Nazi Germany, fleeing Europe in the run-up to World War II. Reich was a disciple of Sigmund Freud, and in particular, he wrote a little book in 1933 called The Mass Psychology of Fascism, while he was still living in Germany at the time, in which he posited that people who were, followers of Adolf Hitler were basically sexually repressed, unhappy people. Hitler didn't like that very much. For some reason, he did not find it very amusing. The book was burned, and Reich had to flee for his life, eventually coming here to teach at the New School. Reich further theorized that if sexual frustration led to fascism, then the way to inoculate a population from fascism was sexual freedom. What did he particularly mean? He wanted to legalize abortion. He wanted to legalize homosexuality. He wanted to make it easier to get divorced. He wanted to make it easier to get birth control. His theory was that people that had a happy, healthy sex life didn't get mixed up with Nazis. Yeah, it's a strange idea. We are going to walk down now to the Jefferson Market Library. I think we'll walk on this side of 6th Avenue. I think that's where the sun is shining. And I don't want you to all freeze to death. Come on. In particular, women who were brought up on various charges, they were tried in this building. And that always puzzled me. And for the answer to that riddle, we're just going to go down and around the corner to the Jefferson Market Community Garden. So this is a nice building, but let's talk about something else. Women being held for the women's court or confined here. Most of the prisoners were prostitutes. There was a kind of a theory in the 20th century that treated female prostitutes as vectors for disease. And if you just confined them and got them off the street, that was a way of reducing syphilis and gonorrhea and things of that sort. He said there were lots of prostitutes in prison here, and the pimps would come and stand outside, and they would yell up and down, back and forth, which kind of annoyed the local residents. Imagine living, say, across the street from this. Also in this prison were women who performed abortions, assisted abortions, provided abortion counseling, because abortion was also illegal. There was a fourth floor. The fourth floor was a wing for the mentally ill women, where they also kept them heavily drugged and confined. And when the drugs wore off, then they would shout obscenities out the window. All of this was torn down in '71, and it was converted into a lovely community garden. Unfortunately, it's closed for the season. I do recommend that you stop by and check it out when it's open. It's a lovely garden and to contribute it. But you should remember what was here before then. So obviously, this is the Stonewall Inn, and this is the birthplace of the modern gay rights movement. It is hard for people to understand that until Stonewall, and even after Stonewall, gay bars were illegal, period. They were illegal. Cops regularly raided them. They regularly arrested everyone in the bar. And this was an ongoing thing. They regularly raided Stonewall, once a month they would come in, especially towards the end of the month when they were behind on their quota. Now, how did they know it was a gay bar? They had a simple kind of point system. People of the same sex touching each other, people of the same sex dancing together, people wearing gender inappropriate clothing, men with long hair or makeup or wearing dresses or anything of that sort. This is particularly confusing in the 1960s when a lot of hippies had long hair. Cops at that time assumed every hippie was gay. This was not necessarily true. The police raided this bar in June of 1969. They had raided it many times before, almost regular as clockwork. But something happened, something a little different. Maybe because it was a hot summer night. Maybe because people just, had too much of it. Nobody really knows who threw the first punch. But an angry crowd started gathering. And as they were arresting people started pushing the cops, throwing punches, throwing things, yelling. It turned into a brawl. The cops were forced to retreat back into the bar. Reinforcements had to come to rescue them from the bar. The next night, cops returned in force again to shut down the bar. Even larger crowds of gays and lesbians gathered, even a bigger riot. This went on for a couple of nights in a row, till finally the mayor at that time, I think it was Wagner, or maybe it was Lindsay, told the cops, stand down, stop raiding the bar, stop doing it. Now, of course, Stonewall's a landmark. I never thought I would live to see that. And I remember it's just another gay bar. Now it's a national landmark. It's a step in the right direction. We're going to go down West 4th Street and cross 6th Avenue again. Sorry for the zigzagging. And it continued to be a progressive church well into the 70s and 80s. In particular, in 1970, there was a case called Abramowitz versus Leskowitz. This was an abortion-related trial, and the judge presiding over this case ruled that women who had abortions were too emotional to testify, and therefore would not be allowed to be witnesses in this case. So what they did at this church, they organized a testify-in, where essentially women could come and talk about their abortion experiences. And oh, by the way, they invited the news media to cover the testify-in. Even though gay marriage was not legal yet in New York State or in the country, he started performing what were called covenant ceremonies for gays and lesbians who wanted to get married. The Methodist Church not so crazy about this. They tried to remove him. They finally had a big meeting in 1984 and said you can't be a Methodist and a homosexual. He then retired. He stepped down as head of the church, although he remained active on the progressive scene for many years after that. Sadly, he died of AIDS in 1992. Even sadder, in about 2005, this church stopped being a church. It was converted into the Novaire, which is a fancy condominium building. The church was divided up into 8 apartments. I don't want to guess how much these apartments go for, but I suspect they are a pretty penny. If you notice now, there's little signs saying don't sit on the steps. This is a private residence. Don't come here. This is also a personal loss to me. My wife and I are very active in the world music scene. We used to also come here for world music concerts before it was turned into condominiums, and that's also part of the story of what is going on. St. Vincent's was turned into condos. This progressive church was turned into condos. A lot of the places that were organizing were centers of organization and centers of care to deal with these issues. They're condos now. They're just condos. Right. We're just going to go another block down to Washington Square Park. Somebody estimated that there may be about 20,000 unclaimed graves under Washington Square Park. Periodically, they stumble across human remains when they're doing construction in the park. In the 18th century, doctors needed cadavers to practice on, and the way they did it was grave robbing, particularly paupers' graves. They would go in the dead of night and dig up bodies so they could practice anatomy and vivisection. This led to the infamous Doctors' Riot of 1788, in which gang of angry citizens, not too happy about grave robbing, attacked a group of doctors. The militia had to be called out to protect the doctors. And for a long time after that, doctors had to keep a low profile because people would just come up in the street and punch them in the face because you're a grave robber. Fortunately, the medical profession has advanced since then. More recently, the Washington Square Park was the site of the Folk Singers Riot, sometimes called the Beatnik Riot, 1961. There were a lot of folk singers in the 50s and 60s who would play music in Washington Square Park. They still were folk singers when I was hanging out in the park in the 70s. The city didn't like that. They passed a law saying you had to have a license to perform folk music in public. Judson Memorial Church. Like Washington Square Church, this is another church with a long progressive history, especially in the 1960s under Reverend Moody. They provided drug counseling for people who had drug problems. They provided abortion and counseling for women looking for abortions. Yes, they were telling people where to get abortions, even though abortion was illegal. It didn't just happen. Nobody gave it to them. They had to go out in the street and they had to take it. And that's really the message I want to end this tour with. We're in a time now when some of these rights, which were very hard fought to get, are endangered, especially with the current administration. And you're going to have to go out and fight for them all over again. And that's the end of the tour. Thank you very much for sticking it out on very cold weather, on very crowded streets. If you enjoy the tour, I have all sorts of business cards and stuff like that. Otherwise, I'll be happy to take any questions, or otherwise I'll just say have a good afternoon. Thank you all. Thank you.